All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining for what I hope to be a free-flowing discussion with two very interesting authors of their recently published book, From Athletics to Engineering, 8 Ways to Support Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for All. So I welcome Mr. Johnnie Johnson and Professor Michael Weber to UMASS Lowell. Thank you for accommodating this event in your schedule. As I presented in the event information to the university, Johnnie Johnson brings experience as a professional athlete, entrepreneur, and inspirational speaker, and who knows quite a bit on achieving success and has written about it as well. And Michael, a professor of mechanical engineering and energy resources at the University of Texas, Austin, is also a prolific writer on energy, whose work is also designed to reach the non-expert in the field. So Johnnie and Michael present an optimistic, what I think is an optimistic and a hopeful story in this book on how our society and the communities we live in can become more engaged in proactive ways to end hateful practices, and not only against racial and ethnic minorities, but also others who come with different experiences and abilities than the majority population. So I'd like our audience to interact with our speakers as much as possible. Post your questions on chat or say it out loud. We'll try to keep an eye out on the hands up icon, but if we miss it, please persist, okay? So to facilitate this conversation, my colleagues and I have identified 4 themes and questions drawn from topics in their book, but I would request the audience to feel free to contribute to the conversation when they see, if they want to. So let me introduce and thank my colleagues who have worked with me to organize this event. Professor Susan Tripathi from Sociology, Samudi Lewis from Education, who worked with me in using this book during our summer ramp program this year. And I also want to thank Ruben Sanka, our Assistant Athletic Director, as well as Associate Dean Nicole Champagne from the Zuckerberg College of Health Sciences, who I work with on our Student Learning Experience and Success DEI Task Force. So with that, I welcome Johnnie and Michael for your remarks.
Great. Thank you so much. We're really honored by the opportunity to have this conversation with you. And we want it to be a conversation. We really don't have a presentation. We don't have any slides, but we might make some opening comments and then just open it up to whatever you want to talk about by answering your questions and having some back and forth. But it might be good for me to start as an engineer. I'll introduce a little bit of who I am and how I came to know Johnnie and how Johnnie and I have worked together for about 13 or 14 years at this point. So as you heard, my name is Michael Weber. I'm a professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Texas. I've been a professor for 15 years. I just got back from a 3-year stint in Paris, where I was the chief science and technology officer at Engie. Engie is one of the world's largest energy companies. And so I was one of the C-level executives there running research innovation. And it was good to get some multinational experience on energy and what the world's going through to get to a cleaner spot with energy. And then I'm just newly back at the University of Texas. In mechanical engineering, I advise students working on energy issues, energy environmental issues at the intersection of commercialization, policy, markets, engineering, and sciences. And I'm sort of cross-listed, so to speak, with civil engineering, the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and the Jackson School of Geosciences. And I also advise some business students. I'm a multidisciplinary person on campus, but heart and soul, or the core of my training, really is in engineering. I also have dabbled in entrepreneurship with different startups and helping run the incubator there, the Clean Energy Incubator, which is a part of campus. So it's kind of who I am as an engineer. And then I had this corporate role in Paris, but I've also worked at startups along the way. So I've got sort of a mixed background of things I've worked on different themes along the way. And what I do with my group of students and the courses I teach is try to build in some lessons that are not strictly engineering. So I teach thermodynamics, a pretty classic engineering course. I teach an energy course that also adds energy engineering and policy, and I also teach entrepreneurship. So between entrepreneurship, energy, and thermodynamics, that's my teaching cycle. And then I have a group of about 20 people, postdocs, PhD students, master students, and undergrads who I supervise for research. And with this group, and really intentionally with this group, and with the classes, I try to include elements of leadership or being a good citizen and civic society, things that are not naturally part of the engineering curriculum, yet are very important for engineers, because we are building things or designing solutions that touch these different elements of society. And so for my supervisees, for my research students, we do a lot of leadership training. We do leadership retreats and this kind of thing, and we bring in outside coaches to work with us. And that's what led me to Johnnie. years ago, I think it was 2008, I reached out to my network of friends and people say, hey, I'm looking for an executive coach or someone who can moderate a leadership conversation with my engineering students. Do you have any recommendations? We're going to be in San Francisco at this certain date for an ASME conference for the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. And a couple of people recommend I talk to Johnnie, who was also a fellow alum of the University of Texas, where I had studied as an undergrad. And I at first was sort of a little skeptical. I was like, well, why would we want a football player working with us engineers? But he came highly recommended, so we tried it. And we had a group discussion over several hours in San Francisco with a view of the Bay Bridge, and the students loved it. And we started to work with Johnnie regularly ever since then. He would come in at least once a year to do some leadership event, either with my students or in the class, and also would do individual coaching with me and a couple of my students, depending on the year. So we had an ongoing coaching relationship where Johnnie was coming in and teaching us life lessons and things that we could use as engineers to be more effective. This all sets us up for 2020. George Floyd is murdered. This is a distressing moment for the nation. It's a distressing moment for my students at the University of Texas. And I should back up and say my group is fairly diverse compared to a typical group of engineers, at least on a gender basis. We have good gender diversity, but we're a mostly white group. We have some international diversity, not a lot of racial diversity, but we're not homogenous either, but we're not super diverse. In my mostly white group of engineers, we're pretty distressed over George Floyd's murder, just really didn't know how to process that information or think about it. And in some ways, for someone my age, I've seen many of these events televised. If you go back to Rodney King and others, and Johnny's seen even more. And so it wasn't quite as much a shock for me, though still shocking, but certainly shocking for the students. And I asked them, I was like, well, do you want Johnnie to come in and lead a discussion with us on race in America and what it's like to be a Black man in America? And they said, that'd be great. They already knew Johnnie, we had a relationship. So yeah, please bring him in. So Johnnie came in last summer, must have been June 2020 at this point, and led a discussion with my students on race in America and some of the issues we're dealing with. And my students were just really quiet. They were listening politely and intently, but didn't know what to say. And I can just imagine that they're afraid to say something that's awkward and embarrassing, even if all meaning. And it just kind of was stunning. And Johnnie and I talked about afterwards, and for us, both of us, the takeaway was these students who are so smart and so well trained and always have something thoughtful to say felt like they had nothing to say. And this is a problem that we need everyone to have a role in this discussion, not just the marginalized and the victims, but those who are part of the power structure need to have a voice and be part of this conversation as well. And that led to doing the book. And by the way, the book was Johnny's idea. And I said, I'm not going to write a book with you, Johnnie. I refused for months. And finally, after discussion, we realized, actually, no, we need to be part of this conversation. That led to the book. So that's just sort of the backup to say that my group of engineers working on energy have benefited from diversifying our worldview by having a former professional athlete as our coach. And there are other ways we benefit from that. And so there's some microcosm lessons from the diversity of our experience that I think is useful for our longevity of our career and other people around us. And then as we deal with other issues more explicitly on diversity around gender and sexual identity and race and other things, I think we will all benefit from a more prosperous and harmonious society. And in fact, that having a more accommodating and open view about what it means to be collaborative and diverse will lead us to that prosperity and harmony for all. So very passionate and excited about this. I know Johnnie is as well. So we collaborate on this book, and we're doing a lot of conversations with universities and corporations on this topic. And so this invitation really fits in with things we're working on. So that's just a little bit of the backstory of me as an engineer and how we came to meet Johnnie, and what Johnnie's meant for me personally and for us as a group, as a coach, and what that might mean as we get into it in terms of lessons learned we can apply to society as we try to find a way to work together. Why don't I stop there? And Johnnie, you might have a few other things to say, of course, and then I know we'll have Q&A with everyone in the audience as well.
Well, I like to begin by thanking Michael. I've known him for years, but the request that I made of him was not an easy one, because it required him to really step outside of a comfort zone that most of us operate in. And that comfort zone could cause us to make decisions, even if we know at the core it's in the best interest of ourselves or our team or whomever. It could easily keep us away from taking certain steps. And so I appreciate Michael's commitment to the process, because I personally, having come from the sports world, and the one unique thing about the sports world is that we create a team, a true team, regardless of who we are, where we came from, what social background, where we fall on the economic scale, what color our skin. And that team has one goal: to collectively perform to the best of its ability, regardless of circumstances. So when we look at that and associate that with everyday life, coaching became a natural thing for me as I transitioned from pro sports to entrepreneurship. And so through that process itself, there are so many obstacles or barriers that can get in the way of us truly using more of our full potential, of us being the very best that we can be. And a lot of the racial and social issues happens to be a part of that process. And so any steps that we can take to eliminate obstacles or barriers as we pursue whatever goals that we're pursuing in life, whether we are an athlete or an engineer, provides us with a unique opportunity to be the very best that we can be. And the thing that I found it very unique when we really look at, I consider myself to be as good of player as I became, an All-American and All-Pro in a league of elite athletes, primarily because of my understanding of from an engineering standpoint, understanding of physics and geometry. The difference as an athlete is I used to have to do that on the run, understanding angles and things along those lines. And Michael taught me how they do it with a slot rule. And so when you put those two together, it became a natural from athletics to engineering. But in sports, there's a reason why the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the professional football team that won the Super Bowl last year, Tom Brady, who is probably, in my opinion, the greatest quarterback in the history of the NFL, there's a reason why the Tampa Bay Buccaneers football team do not have a team full of Tom Brady's. They have big 300-pound offensive linemen. They have medium-sized tight ends. They have smaller running backs, quicker, agile wide receivers. They're all different backgrounds, all different racial groups. But when they come together and get in that huddle, they have one thing in common. And that's kind of the approach that we take with the 8 ways that we've identified within the book, because those 8 ways, when you really look at them, it could care less what color you are, where you come from, or the background that you came from. So having said that, we're thankful to have this opportunity to spend this time with you. And I once again thank Michael for his role, because there was a certain audience that I knew we would have, and myself personally, would have a greater challenge in connecting with without his presence, and vice versa on my front as well. So thank you very much for having us spend this time with you.
It's great. I should add one more comment about Johnnie. He said it, but I want to make sure people hear it, that though he's defined by many people by his career as an athlete, in fact, more of his career has been as an entrepreneur. And he had a very successful real estate business and a successful just business career as a coach and many other things. In fact, he's one of our most popular guest lecturers in my entrepreneurship course. So that's something like sometimes the entrepreneur isn't the image that's presented to us on TV. And that's one of the things I tell my class, entrepreneurship. It's mostly freshmen I teach. We say, look, if you look at a television show, you name the show, entrepreneurs are almost always presented as a white guy from the Bay Area wearing a hoodie. But this is in fact not what entrepreneurship's like in America. Most entrepreneurs are in their 40s and have a lot of business experience, and they're much more diverse than you think. And Johnnie's like just one of many examples on this. So it's very interesting that you're not coming back to give guest lectures to the athletic department of UT. You're coming back to your guest lectures on entrepreneurship. And it's just like one other way that you sort of break the mold of how people might try to define you, but where you are now.
Michael, I appreciate that. I make one other quick point. When I was on campus at the University of Texas and I got anywhere near that mechanical engineering building, I used to turn and go the other direction because I was afraid a slide rule was going to come out of there and hit me upside the head or something like that. So I hear exactly what Michael is saying from that standpoint, and I appreciate that. And as a Black man, I appreciate it even more because it's real easy to be characterized, stigmatized, and even labeled as just an athlete or even a dumb jock.
That's great.
All right. Thank you for those insights. So Johnny, have you since gone back and taken one of Michael's courses in ME, like statics or dynamics?
I know my limits, and he'll never have to worry about me taking one of those courses.
Although he did get a little bit of the professor side of me. So we've been friends and colleagues and collaborators, but in the process of writing the book, one of the things I had to do is get out of my comfort zone and talk about subjects that are sensitive, like race in America and that kind of thing. And so I had to grow and learn to get out of my comfort zone. And the thing that Johnny had to do is he had to give his writing to me to be edited. And having a professor mark up your work isn't always fun, as I'm sure students will recall. And so he didn't have to take my engineering class, but he did get the red pen of the professor at one point.
Yes,
I held my breath every time I sent it over for him to review.
Yeah. No, okay. So let's see. Ready for the hard questions. So
I think Ruben I think Ruben has his hand up. Did you want to ask a question, Ruben?
Yes. Thank you both, Michael and Johnny, for your introduction. Johnny, as you mentioned, from your experience, and you mentioned something about the stigma of the student athlete, and in our athletic department, one of the things that we're trying to do is to provide different opportunities for our student athletes to have a great experience, not just as an athlete, but also an experience within the community that they live in here in Lowell and back home. One of the things that we're trying to communicate with the students is trying to find their own identity, not just as a student athlete, but also their invisible identity that they may have that other people don't know. And I think from student athletes, there tend to be a lot of stereotype about who they are and how they can handle different situations. Oftentimes, they're people think of them of just being this invincible person because they're playing a high level Division I sports, but there are certain issues that sometimes can be ignored just because we tend to stigmatize who student athletes are and what their identity should be. And a couple of the things, for example, especially lately in the news, as you've seen, student athletes and Black athletes are being, they're being stigmatized on what they can be. And a lot of these other issues, such as mental health and their ability to be their own selves, are sort of like being ignored. Is there something that you can maybe touch on in your own experience that you've had with different identities and stereotypes, and how you handle those situations when someone, for example, for you being an entrepreneur, but also a great student athlete and a great athlete after, do you think people kind of viewed you more of an athlete, or how did they be able to distinguish your own identity?
Ruben, that's an excellent question. And quite often when Michael and I are introduced, and Michael is the engineer and I'm the coach, that is counterintuitive. That's counteractive to what society normally would view it. And so I think it begins with each one of us personally. And each of us personally, although I was an athlete, #1 draft pick in the National Football League, played 10 years in the NFL. I'm here. I believe that there's a God, and I believe that God put me here for a higher purpose than just to be an athlete. And if we're able to determine what that is personally, what that is in life, and that purpose usually is going to revolve around using more of our full potential and helping someone else be the very best that they can be. And if we personally do not allow someone else to place labels on us, that's really important. It comes from us personally. It provides us with a step in the direction to use more of our full potential, but to really pursue whatever that purpose in life, even if it's counterintuitive to what society has labeled us to be from that standpoint. So starts with each of us. And then in terms of dealing with society as a whole, if we identify what our purpose in life, then we'll find that quite often it's beyond the labels that's been identified and placed on us.
Thank you for that answer. And one of the things that we have been trying to encourage our student athletes is to use their platform to make impact in social changes within their community. So I think they all, we all have some sort of a platform, but yet at the same time, you're trying to basically coach them to understand that that platform that you have, it's a privilege that you have that platform, but it's not fully what your identity is.
Right.
Your identity is not limited to what you are in your current state, but it can evolve and change over time. So thank you for that answer.
Ruben, if I can just add one quick thing, because I think this is really important as well. Sometimes we expect a person of color, and specifically an athlete, to be able to do it all.
Yes.
And it's interesting because if it's a team sport, in that sport, we are also communicating to make sure that they contribute as part of that team, but we turn right around in society and ask them to come out and do certain things on their own. So one of the things that I really appreciated most about sports was being part of a team. And so it's the relationships that we develop in society. My relationship with Michael Weber, people look at it. When I go back on campus, any campus, but particularly the University of Texas, and I explain the relationship with Michael Weber, that's a comfort zone that I didn't think I had in me when I was at the University of Texas. So I think for all of the student athletes, your ability to work with them to expand beyond their existing comfort zone, to feel comfortable with teaming outside of sports with a Michael Weber or with someone that's going to enable them to bring that purpose to life. And that's going to enable them to use more of their full potential across and provide them with greater opportunities across several planes, in my opinion.
Thank you, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you, Ruben and Johnnie. So one of the questions that we had, and Yohav is here, I think I'm going to have him ask it, is your collaboration, as you note in the book, began probably more than a decade ago, right? As you stated, but it was witnessing George Floyd's death that brought about this need to explore and write about these topics related to race discrimination and DEI. So my question is, were there not these discussions on these topics before this incident in your collaboration? And if not, what was missing to spark those discussions early on? I mean, it goes to point out, is there going to be a collective memory depreciation over time in our society, similar to the Rodney King incident, that over time we begin to forget and go back to normal? So what is it that's different this time, perhaps, that things might actually change? That's
a great question. I mean, so I would say that Johnnie and I worked together for a long time, but race or diversity issues or anti-discriminatory practices were not an explicit part of the conversation that he and I have with each other, with the students. But teamwork and collaboration had been. And implicit in teamwork and collaboration is this idea that everyone has a role in the team and your team's got to have a diverse skill set and this kind of thing. So we never really dealt with it head on or directly for a variety of reasons. It wasn't the issue on our minds. It wasn't the thing we're worried about. We had other macro issues going on with elections and financial collapse in 2008 and other things. So don't mean for that to sound like excuses, but it just frankly wasn't on our minds the same way. And I had spent a lot of time with Johnnie working on team, but my team diversity initiatives were almost exclusively focused on gender diversity. We have a problem in engineering where at the University of Texas, just a little over 20% of the student population are made up of women students, the rest men. So we're not the worst on campus. Nursing's worse from a lack of diversity perspective than engineering, but we're not one of the best. And in my group, it's more like 40%. So we're almost 50-50, and that was intentional. And I would tackle that problem first. And then I started to tackle international diversity issues. My group was, I would felt like too American. And so we lacked global perspective. So I wanted more international diversity, and never really dealt with racial diversity for my group. So it didn't come up in our conversations with Johnnie, but was never like left off the table or excluded. It was never like, we're not going to talk about it. We just didn't. Then what seems different to me with George Floyd's murder, and Johnnie, I'm sure, will have perspective as well, is the videotape of it, the cell phone tape of it. And cell phones have changed the world because these allegations of mistreatment by the police are not new and been around for decades, but the quantity and quality of the video evidence has increased a lot. And it's by everyday people. The Rodney King one was an exception. It happened to be a person who had a camera, which cameras are rare back then in the early 90s, who could zoom in across the highway to the frontage road or the side of the highway on the other side. Again, that was really rare, the Rodney King event. But the Black community have been saying for decades that that kind of thing actually is not that rare. That just happened to be videotaped. Then you see more and more evidence of different killings and different people mistreated. The George Floyd one's different though, because it was so long. It was so many minutes. It was so unnecessary. Not that any of them were necessary, but this one was so obviously a sign that something was amiss in society that it resonated differently, I think, with the students. And there have been many other killings. I mean, think of what had been going on in Ferguson in 2016 and others. So it's not like this is the only one or the only one since Rodney King. There are many, but there was something about George Floyd that resonated more with everyone, including my students. And I think it's like at some point, like, this is preposterous. Like, this person went so far out of the way to make sure he was dead is kind of what it looked like, which is why he was convicted of murder. So it just felt like the incident was more stark in how horrible it was. There was a weird mismatch with the peacefulness of the event and how destructive it was to human life that captured the attention of people. So I felt like George Floyd, the video evidence of it was just different for the students. And once the students are different, professors will start to take notice and that kind of thing. So that's my perspective. Johnnie, I'm sure you've got some thoughts or comments on that.
Yes,
as well.
I think probably one of the most significant features, elements, components after George Floyd. I think prior to that, we knew that there were issues, problems, challenges, but it was almost as if we wanted just the marginalized communities to solve them, and that it was their problem. They need to figure out a way. And then after the George Floyd's passing, it seems like it became more of a team effort. And I'm here to say, you know, this is one of those things that unless we have support from key allies, nothing will change. And as we move forward, if those key allies, and in this case, allies are the Michael Webbers of the world, coming along with us, and people that you all know as well, and truly creating a diverse team pursuing these common goals, then progress will not be made to the degree that we will need it to be made in order for change to take place with the way we all envision. And so I just thought the Rodney King, you know, the video, the fact that we witnessed this on video, and if you took the time to sit there and watch it for however many minutes, we watched that, and it was something that most of us have seen. That was enough for everyone to say, hey, look, going forward, I'm going to support this in some way, no matter who I am. And I'm thankful for that opportunity that's been presented to the world as well.
Okay. So your book is in some ways designed, I guess, I'm thinking, to sort of promote that discussion and not lose that cognizance of where we are right now. So with that, Yoav, you had a question for Professor Weber, I think.
Yes, thank you both for coming. I want to ask, what's been the response to the book so far since it was released, specifically in the engineering field / academia? And is it what you expected?
That's a great question. And well, the reactions were very positive, and we're very pleased by that, because it's always scary to write a book and put it out there. But this subject's so sensitive. I think Johnny and I had a little trepidation, like, we got to do it. Well, let's hope it goes well. And the reaction's been almost universally and uniformly positive. In fact, I'm having trouble thinking of any direct criticism or complaints about it. So that's the good news. And I'll talk about the engineering reaction first. But let me back up and tell you a little bit about what Johnny and I were told as we let people know we're working on the project. And we had a different reaction. Johnny and I are working on this project together. And as Johnny's telling people would tell him, oh, great, we need your voice out there. This is good. And he got a lot of encouragement, like, please write this, please get your voice out there. And when I would tell people I work on this, they say, okay, well, that's good. I'm glad you're working on it. But they would also say, well, watch out. This could blow up in your face. This could be a career killer. I was given more of a warning that there's a risk for me to engage in this conversation, because I might be misinterpreted. I might say the wrong thing. There are all sorts of things that can go wrong. And certainly I know people who have said stupid racist stuff and lost their jobs. And I guess the point is, I probably shouldn't say stupid racist stuff, but this has happened. And so I'm getting warnings that maybe I shouldn't do it because it's risky, but Johnny's getting a lot of encouragement. So we're given different feedback beforehand about how this might go for us. Then the book is out, and it's just, we haven't really publicized the book, but people are stumbling across it. Corporations are using it for internal trainings, this kind of thing. The feedback's been really positive, because the goal with the book is not to point a finger of blame at who did what wrong, or who's being mean, or who's being reactionary or sensitive or anything like that. It's really laying out principles of action, the things that we can do together, but also with an intent of motivating that the goal is worthwhile. That if we wish for harmony and prosperity for all, diversity, equity, inclusion is a pathway to that, but also an outcome of that, that these things all go together. And so we are really focusing on the different aspects that are relevant, the actions we can take, that kind of. So the feedback's been positive, and we've been testing it with very sort of aligned groups who care a lot about diversity, equity, inclusion. They have given us thumbs up and really like it as a entry level book on this topic. But we've also been testing with very sort of right-wing conservative groups that you might think not like it, and they like it and are happy with it. So this is good news. I will say that the question that might be really specifically off was like, well, what about engineering audiences? They like it. Our first talk, we've done many talks now. I'm sure we'll do hundreds of talks on the book before it's all said and done. Our very first talk was at the Colorado School of Mines and Engineering School. So that was actually the place where we started the conversation publicly on this. And I think there's a natural fit there, because engineering in the world of engineers is dealing with its own diversity problems. I mentioned gender diversity. There's all sorts of diversity challenges within engineering as well. So it shouldn't be a problem for engineering. It should not be an affront to the principles of engineering. In fact, good engineering teams should have diverse skill sets and people with diverse backgrounds on the teams. We highlight that in the book. So the reception has been pretty good, I would say, so far. And I know Johnny has some thoughts too, because he shared it with some. Johnny has access to all sorts of different groups around the nation and the world. So they've told him some funny things as well.
That indeed. I have the pleasure in my world of like staying right in the center, and just kind of the way I view the world is roughly you may be working on something, and 80% of the people you come in contact with or work with is going to come along with you, but there's always going to be 10% that's going to be on one side and another 10% on another side. And no matter what you do, it's going to be more challenging to bring those two groups together. And so fortunately, so far, as Michael indicated, I can't really think of any negative feedback that we received from the book. Obviously, people may have different thoughts and opinions, but at the core, when you look at our purpose, it's not to call anyone out. We're taking more of that sports approach to it. And can you imagine one of your teammates who's pursuing to be the very best that you can be as a team coming in the huddle and saying something counterintuitive or negative as it relates to pursuing whatever it is in sports? I view that as a similar approach in any sector of society. It's just that the perception of athletics and engineering are far apart, when in reality, they're right next to each other. And therefore, that's why when you look at the 8 ways that we've identified, it's really about prosperity for all. It's about harmony for all. But it's about being the very best that you can be. It's about using your full potential. It's about teams coming together and supporting each other in a way where, regardless of what obstacle or barrier, and no matter what we're pursuing, there are going to be obstacles or barriers that we're going to encounter. It's about overcoming those, and for certain, not allowing things like race and discrimination and other things like that get in the way of pursuing you being the very best that you can be, you or your team.
So I think, Susan, you got another question?
Yeah, okay, thank you so much. This is so interesting. One thing we were wondering, you've been talking today and also in chapter 3 of your book, you point out how everyone really needs to talk about gender, race, and ethnic disparities, not just the people that are marginalized and most affected by those disparities. So I know Leon had a question here about how to do that. In other words, how to create safe spaces where these discussions can actually take place. Leon, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. I was just wondering about what advice would you give to help us actually create a safe and open environment where we're able to actually discuss our opinions and biases without like the fear of repercussion from saying them?
Michael, if okay, I'll go first on this one. That's a great question. And what's really interesting is so much of what we do in life revolves around what we call 7 words in the book: our beliefs, our habits, our attitudes, and our expectations. And then it's managing both ours and other people's personalities, egos, and emotions. And unfortunately, there are some hot ticket words, phrases that really sets people off. In other words, as a Black man, I don't want to be called a lazy person. I don't want to be thought of as someone who solely is on welfare, although I grew up and graduated from high school on the welfare system. There are people who don't want to be called a racist. So we have to talk about it, but we have to create that safe space, and creating the safe space, in my opinion, begins with not being fearful that if you make a mistake or if you said a wrong thing, that you're going to be called out or you're going to be labeled a certain way. And so we're very careful in our work to try not to put anyone in that situation, because we understand from an emotional standpoint that there's anger, there's frustrations, there's fear, all those things that all of us deal with. And we don't want to trigger those, but at the same time, we want to be able to speak candidly about topics that needs to be discussed and talked about, because that can't just be done by, as we've said on several occasions, by people in the marginalized communities. That has to be done by everyone. So really managing people's personalities, egos, and emotions will go a long ways towards helping create that safe space, and doing so without fear.
I just want to double down on some of the things Johnnie said. I think we want to make this point that we can't reserve the conversation of these issues to those who are experts. There are too few experts. We all need to be part of this. I mean, how many people are experts on these subjects? Very few, and maybe more people have some experience, but we all need to engage. We can't leave it to just the people who have a PhD in, I don't know, the psychology of diversity or something like that. There just aren't enough of us. So we need more of us to engage. We also just cannot reserve the conversation to those who are afflicted negatively. Say, well, you sort it out. People who are members of the power structure need to be allies and champions, a part of the conversation as well. And I would say in particular, straight white men are in the power structure and need to be allies for this and need to engage. If it's just Black poor people who are part of the conversation, and this is all, like, I don't like to even say it that way, but if we just leave it to the marginalized groups, how does this get solved? It doesn't get solved. And at some point, you need the power structure to be part of the conversation. That's one thing to say. We really have to all be part of the conversation, not just the experts, not just those who are negatively afflicted. And those who benefit from the current inequities should be part of it too. They should realize that there's some benefit they get from it. Right? There are trade-offs to this, and some people lose and some people win. The people who win from the unfairness need to understand that's part of it. So that's part of the reply. The other thing I say is, if you are in an organization, a company, a school, an entity, a group that does not have a good communication strategy to begin with, like you don't communicate well, it's not a safe place to communicate, people are scorned for their ideas, they are put down or bullied, you're not going to be able to have a conversation on these topics very well. Like this isn't a great topic to start with. You should be working to create a good communication flow regardless. And then as you build that, you can add in more sensitive topics. And frankly, any team has to communicate well to succeed anyway. You want a team that communicates well just to deal with the business challenges you'll have or the educational challenges you have if you're a university. And if you're a football player on a team, you have to communicate well as a team because you have to know what everyone's doing. So good communication is at the foundation of success for any group, an organization, a team anyway. And you have an interest and you should be motivated to solve that. And if it's in bad shape, talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion doesn't necessarily make it better. So you got to get it strong and then work with these topics. But certain elements about this is everyone needs to be heard. They need to be heard without judgment. If someone says something and they're criticized, that doesn't make them want to speak again, they'll withdraw. So they need to be able to think out loud. And sometimes when we think out loud, we'll think bad thoughts out loud. We need to give some space for that. And I think one of the main strategies is to make sure you are understanding what they're saying rather than convincing them you're right. Too much of our conversation is around persuasive writing or persuasive speaking, where we feel like our job is to convince you that I am correct. Certainly in the political environment, that's what's going on right now. And instead of focus on how to prove that we're right or convince them of our position, we should spend our time understanding their position. It doesn't mean we agree, and we might not agree, but at least we should understand it. And so if we spend more time listening, more time understanding, and less time speaking and less time persuading, I think we'll get to a better spot.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. That really gives some great ideas for how to create these spaces and make them places that where people will really have the courage to speak out. Because I was trying to relate this a bit too at the beginning of the book, where you, Michael, talk about white speechlessness and how that can, people can feel very uncomfortable, especially white people, talking about these things initially. And I was wondering, if you could say a little bit more too about the, how you encourage people to develop the courage to speak out. You talked about creating the safe spaces and some of the elements that go into that, both you and Johnnie did. And I'm wondering if there's anything else that's needed to try to encourage people to, to be courageous and to really speak what's on their minds.
That's a great question. And let me talk about sort of the world of engineering, because this is especially true with engineering. The engineering is filled with a lot of introverts, frankly, people who might not want to speak in public or raise their voice, who prefer to work alone. That's not a fair stereotype in many ways, but there are many introverts in engineering. And the joke goes like this: how do you tell the difference between an introverted engineer and an extroverted engineer? An introverted engineer will look at her shoes while talking to you, but an extroverted engineer will look at your shoes while talking to you. This is kind of the joke. He's talking about how introverted and extroverted engineers are. And so now we have to take these engineers and say, okay, now get up in front of an audience and present your work, which you have to do if you're a researcher, or if you're at a business meeting, you're designing a bridge or whatever you're doing as an engineer, you have to stand up and deliver and present your work. And if you ask an engineer to present their calculations on the truss design for a bridge, usually they're not nervous because they really understand what they're talking about and they feel confident about it. You ask them to get up in front of the audience and talk about race in America, they will feel nervous because it's a subject matter over which they have less confidence. So generally speaking, if people are confident that they understand a subject, they will be more comfortable talking about it. So one way to improve the courage, so to speak, is to improve the confidence and the competence of the mastery of the subject material. So that's education, make sure we're all familiar with it. That's one thing. But another thing is, even some really smart students who are the smartest person in the room on that topic will still get nervous in a presentation. It's not unusual for my students to have stage fright or that kind of thing. I still get stage fright, and I'm a professional speaker. And so one thing we work on when we train for public speaking, I think this is appropriate for conversations as well, is you should focus on saying things you know to be true and you say it, that here's what I know to be true. And if you're not sure it's true, you say things like, here's what I think. I don't know it's true, but here's what it feels like. But you can use your words to differentiate where I know this to be true, and I have a feeling that this might be true. We can use our words to caveat appropriately. And that has a way of disarming critics and softening the tone, rather than to be a know-it-all, say this is the way it is, and I know, even if it's on a subject you don't really know much about. So we can use our wordings and phrasings to really position it properly so it's received the right way. But the ultimate guide for how to get over stage fright, this is going to sound funny, is to not care what they think, but to care about them. People get nervous when they care what the other person thinks about what they're saying. And so if we worry too much what they think, we'll get nervous and we won't have as much confidence. And instead of worrying what they think, we should worry about whether shouldn't care what they think. We should care about them. Is what am I saying good for this person? And is what am I saying true? This kind of, if we focus on what we know to be true, what we understand to be correct, and if we don't know it's true, but we think it's true, if we use our words properly, and we don't care so much about whether they're going to judge us, the courage will get there. And so there's a lot of elements that go into it. Know what you're talking about. If you don't know what you're talking about, you can still talk about it. You don't have to be an expert, but just be clear, like, well, I'm not really sure, but here's what I think. And make sure you don't worry too much what they think about you, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't care about them. And I think it's important. I'm trying to think of this is an extreme. I wouldn't go to this extreme. Miles Davis, great jazz trumpeter, great musician, would come out and play, would turn his back on the audience. He didn't care what they thought. He was playing for his band, and he was giving them the right to pay money to listen to him play with his band. I'm not sure you should turn your back on the audience. That's not the way to go. But he got to a point where he just didn't care what they thought. He was there to make great music. And if you want to hear great music, he would do it as well. And I'm not sure that kind of arrogance or cockiness is right, but that sense that it doesn't matter what the audience thought about him. It didn't matter to him. He was going to make great music. And I think we need to get to a point where it doesn't matter what the audience thinks about me. I'm going to say to you things that I believe to be true based on my engineering analysis. And this is really important because the engineers who don't speak up are the ones who know the space shuttle is going to blow up or the bridge is going to fall down. We need them to speak up when they know something is true on every issue. So I don't know if that's a very good answer for you. It's hard to get the courage,
really helpful. Yeah.
But confidence and competence are a basis for that, and caring about the other people, but not caring what they think.
Yeah.
Susan, if I can just add one thing to that, we all have biases and blind spots. And so when we speak and we understand we have biases and blind spots, and as Michael touched on, I think the real key, both for the presenter or the speaker and then the audience, is to understand that we all have biases and blind spots, and how we respond or how we react when we hear something that counteracts our beliefs, our expectations, I believe will go a long ways when we are involved in communicating in diverse groups. The one thing that I've learned over the years, coming from where I came from, because I grew up in a real small rural area, is if I'm able to expand my comfort zone and understand what some of my biases are, and I'm willing to listen, hear, and understand without making judgment on what's being communicated to me. If I really try to process it, to see it through the lens of what they may be trying to communicate to me, then I'm gonna receive it, even if it's not something I believe in an entirely different perspective than if I approach it from the standpoint of being so convinced that my way of thinking is not only the right way, it's the only way. And so this is why I think it's so important for us to understand that we do have these biases and blind spots, and how they can impact us anytime we're listening, hearing, or communicating with someone else, particularly when we're dealing around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and race.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
I think given that we have roughly 10 minutes left, to conclude this, so Madhu, maybe you want to go to the last chapter of the book that we were talking about?
Yeah, sure. So in your last chapter, the align actions with goals and values, I really like this chapter because it brings through to me about one of the things, especially the line about don't let obstacles stop you. because I see the process of, when you have an obstacle, you identify the obstacle, and then you kind of start to remove whatever it is that's sustaining that obstacle so you can move forward. So my question to you is, do you have a particular way that you help people to identify their core values and remove the obstacles that gets in the way?
Yeah, Johnny should go first on this one for sure.
Yes. One of the things people ask me quite often what I miss most about playing pro football. And obviously I don't miss getting hit time and time again by big, powerful men. What I miss most is actually being booed by the crowd whenever we played on the road. So people say, what do you mean? You like getting booed? Yes, I love getting booed. Because we go on the road and it's 80,000 of them and it's 53 of us. Those are obstacles that we have to work and overcome. So how do we keep our focus on what the fundamental activity of whatever it is that we are pursuing, whether it's in sports or in life? So there's something that drives us, knowing that there are always obstacles or barriers that are going to be in the way. And our core values are one of the things that establishes the foundation. And every day we work to consistently try to make sure we stand by our core values. But then how do we deal with these obstacles or barriers when they appear, when they show up? And this is where our actions have to align. This is where if it's challenging, because if I believe that someone from a marginalized community is less of a person, if I place more value on myself versus someone in that space, then in reality, that's going to show up in some regard. So aligning our actions is with our goals, with our aims, is no different than staying focused on the fundamentals of playing the game of football, despite 80,000 people booing, cheering, throwing things and saying things that we wouldn't repeat anywhere else. But we don't allow that to get in the way of us taking the steps to achieve the fundamentals that we've set out to achieve that day. And that could be weather related. This is why I love football, because no matter what the circumstances are, you play, other than lightning. It can be 15 degrees below zero or 105 degrees, and you're going to play the game. It can be 80,000 against you or 80,000 for you, and you're going to play the game. So we kind of view that in that context in this chapter.
Okay.
And Michael, you may want to
Anna.
add.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I don't want to add on. Let's move on to the next question. But great answer, Johnny.
Okay.
I think Anna,
yeah.
sorry. Anna, you have a question?
Yeah, let me pull it up because I had it pulled up and then I lost it.
I think it backs up what Johnny was just talking about. It was related to their own experiences regarding DEI, right? And was it difficult to reflect on them when writing your book?
Yeah.
Yeah. If that's, you feel free to state the question if you want, unless that was it.
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly it.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things. One of the points Johnny and I like to make is that we followed these steps in the process of collaborating on this book. Things like we had to get started, we had to be understanding of each other, like love your neighbor, we had to get out of our comfort zone, we had to talk about it. There are all these things that we did. So we followed the steps of the book to write the book about the steps we need, because this activity of collaborating from diverse backgrounds on a book like this is a microcosm experience that is indicative of larger collaborations. So we had to go through the process to do it. And along the way, there are memories we have to recount, where there are anecdotes Johnny's telling where like, that was not a great memory. I'm not really, it's not fun to have to like relive that experience. And I also had to relive my own experiences. And I was rarely the victim of injustices, but perhaps the beneficiary or perpetrator of the injustices. That's awkward and embarrassing to think about and admit and write about. So we both had to go through our own background. And by the way, Johnny's life wasn't one of only discrimination. His was also one of privilege. And my life wasn't one only privilege. I also dealt with other issues as well. But the balance might be tilted one way or another, depending on your background. But we had to go through it, be honest with ourselves, and therefore honest with each other, and then honest on paper about it. So it was difficult, but I think that's part of the process. We all have it. No one's got an unblemished life, good or bad. And so we need to be honest about that. And in recognizing that helps build a tone of understanding, I think, in your conversations.
Okay. I think, Sumudha, you had an interesting question for Michael with respect to his teaching and research and how that's changed, I think.
Yes, that's it. So yeah, in athletics, there are goals of winning the game and actions needed to achieve that. So Professor Weber, my question to you is, how do you equate that in your teaching and research with respect to winning the game of DEI for all? And how has your own research program and practices with your students and other collaborators in your field changed as a result of this book and the topics you present in it?
That's a great question. And I'll give one example. I'm doing a big study right now on pathways for decarbonizing Texas. Texas is by far the largest energy consumer of the 50 states and by far the largest emitter of carbon dioxide. In fact, Texas is the 6th largest carbon dioxide emitter in the world. So we're up there with countries like Germany and Canada and that kind of thing. So we're analyzing how to get to a net zero future in Texas. Complicated analysis, takes 2 years. Along the way, we start that project. Along the way, John and I work on this book. The book is published. We have added sections to this report on Texas, not just on jobs and the economy and hydrogen and wind and solar, but we have a section related to equity and social justice and environmental justice, which is not only how can we decarbonize Texas, but what will the impacts be on Texas for different communities? Reducing CO2 usually goes hand in hand with reducing pollution. Pollution is always in just about every society felt more by the poor and the brown, not the rich and the white. And so decarbonizing Texas has an equity benefit in terms of reducing pollution. It also has social justice challenges because there'll be a lot of job losses in oil and gas to decarbonize, but a lot of job creation for wind and solar and that kind of thing. And the jobs for coal plants are in East Texas, but the jobs for wind and solar are in West Texas. That is its own challenge. It might not have a racial challenge associated with it, but it's an equity issue. If one population group will lose jobs, another population group gains jobs, that a problem. So we now very intentionally and specifically will talk about that in our research, and we'll actually quantify it and do some analysis about what job changes will there be and what air pollution will there be changes and who does it affect. So we start about who are the beneficiaries or impacted by the different pathways. So that's one way my engineering analysis has changed. And the other thing I would say that's changed is the sponsors of research. So most research is sponsored by someone, National Science Foundation or a foundation of some sort. They're starting to ask to include those elements as well. So the supporters of research are getting a little more savvy about being aware, like, oh, we probably should pay attention to the human side of the equation, not just the engineering side, but what transportation infrastructure you build and where you build it will have all sorts of impact on different neighborhoods and populations. And instead of just building the dirty stuff in the poor neighborhood, maybe we should think about that in a more sensitive way. So I'm seeing that in the last year and a half, there's been a lot more attention from the sponsors and the audiences and the researchers to include these issues in different ways. So that's one way it shows up. Another way it shows up is the way I recruit students. I told you I focused on gender diversity, then I focused on international diversity. Now I'm focusing more on other types of diversity, most specifically racial diversity. And by the way, international diversity is another way to get to racial diversity. So I'm a little more active on that. And sometimes when you're choosing PhD students, the pool of students you choose from are not up to you. They're presented to you, they might not be diverse enough. So I have a little more say in how I recruit among the undergrads. So I'm intentionally trying to diversify the pool of undergraduate research. I have like 5 or 6 undergrads who work for me at any given time. And so I've changed some of my actions on student recruiting. Sponsors have changed some of their questions they ask and their priorities. And then we're including different analysis and sections in our big research projects.
Okay. So 402, I'd like to quickly open up.
Question. As a person of color in the marginalized communities, when we talk about becoming more diverse, one of the things that we hate most is if there's a perception, or even if it's in reality, that we gain a position merely because we are a person of color and not on merit. And as Michael were talking just now, and this is why I love sports so much, that they have this system in place where they ultimately, for the most part, are going to take the most qualified person, regardless of who they are, because their goal is to put the best product on the field or on the court. And so one of the things today, as we work towards becoming more diverse, we're looking for harmony and prosperity for all. We really are looking for putting the best product on the field. Ruben is, when his athletic department is, regardless of what sport, male or female, they are looking to recruit the top athletes and collectively put the ones on the court or field that's going to perform to best. And whether that's engineering, athletics, corporate America, a neighborhood, the softball game or whatever, that's the approach that we are encouraging people to view and look at, and not just because of the fact that someone is Black or Hispanic or of some other ethnicity.
Yep. Does Grace have a point there, or is it Grace? Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that it looked like Ruben had raised his hand, but I can ask the question too. I
don't think we can hear you. We're not hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I can hear you.
So I guess my question was, so I don't know, you may be aware that there is like some overtly racist incidents at one of the other UMass Lowell campuses, not UMass Lowell, UMass campuses against Black students very recently. And Professor Weber, I was wondering, having been in higher ed environment for a while, how should faculty and administration at all levels, university and college, become more active in preventing such incidents and assure students that they are actively engaged in these efforts?
That's a great question. And we also had these incidents that happened at the University of Texas, especially when COVID was hitting. We had a lot of anti-Asian sentiment that popped up. There was some graffiti, this kind of thing. There were Zoom bombers. People were popping into unsecured Zoom classrooms to say inappropriate things. And it happens. And it kind of comes and goes. Sometimes it feels like it's a local reflection of whatever the national political zeitgeist is, if that makes sense, the spirit of the times. And so I feel like there's been more racial flare-ups the last few years, but the decade before that was quiet. When I was a student at the University of Texas, late 80s, early 90s, there was a lot of tension. There were white fraternities that had sort of blackface caricature cartoon characters on their t-shirts for parties. So these things happen, and I feel like it's been part of the collegiate story for a long time, and it kind of comes and goes in these waves. And one of the challenges that historically there's been a view from the administration or faculty, like, kids are being kids, like, let's not worry about it too much. And I think the view has changed now, is that actually we faculty and administrators and leaders need to take an active role to say that is not acceptable, appropriate behavior, and that you can't do that. And if it's bad behavior by a student on campus, there's all sorts of things you do. You can kick the student off out of campus, you can reprimand them, put on probation. There are a lot of things you do because we have an honor code at the University of Texas, and most universities do. So if it's a student, there's a lot of things that can be done. If it's someone that's not a student or not a part of campus, there are fewer tools, unfortunately, other than to let people know you disagree with it. But then sometimes it happens from a faculty member. That's harder, because faculty members are often protected by tenure for a reason, which is so that faculty can say thought-provoking or provocative stuff. That doesn't mean you can do hate speech, but it's harder if the faculty member is a problem. And we've also had those incidents. I think these days it's less about race, but you might have all sorts of homophobic comments or transphobic. So you have faculty are saying things that really aren't appropriate and are not creating a comfortable space for learning. That's harder. So I would say universities are better today than they were decades ago, but there's still a long way to go. And I think we faculty and administrators have a role to play. That's the way I'd say it. Like, we have to set the example, hold the line, and take action wherever we can.
Okay. All right, to conclude, Ruben, you got the last shot here.
All right, thank you. My question is, or just a thought is, in sports, we do have a lot of diversity in different identities that we have within sports. But I often think that type of diversity can sometimes be taken for granted, and when we do take it for granted, we fail to actually create policies and procedures that provide inclusion and equity within the athletics department. What are your thoughts on making sure, or creating practices and policies that are able not just to allow us to take in the diversity in different identities for granted, but also put in policies that make things more equitable within the athletics?
Michael, if it's okay, I'll begin that, and then I'd love your thought, Michael, from an engineering standpoint with the question. Ruben, thank you, because it's a very, very powerful question. What's interesting is you would think in athletics, because of the nature of the environment, you would have less of that. But it goes back to the leaders and their beliefs and their habits and their expectations and even their attitudes. And so, and it's unfortunate. And that's why aligning your actions with your values and your goals are so really critically important. So I think one of the things that could be most impactful is really emphasizing what those values are and what those goals are. And with merit, pursue those and hold people to those standards. I referenced this in the book. One area that I found very interesting is when I was in high school, I went to a predominantly white high school. So we won the state championship in the state of Texas. And in order to do that, including the preseason games, you play 17 games. You play a lot of games down there, including the preseason games, to win the state championship. And I was a defensive back and a running back in high school. As a defensive back, I was the only Black defensive back, and the other three were white. When I very first got to the University of Texas, when I first arrived, I started as a freshman. And as a freshman, there were 2 Black defensive backs and 2 white defensive backs when I very first got to Texas. When I got to the Rams as a #1 draft pick, I started right away. And the starters, there were 1 Black, me. I'm sorry, there were 3 Blacks and 1 white guy. When I left the Rams, the entire defensive backfield were all Black. And that was in a matter of about 20 years. And so in preparation for this book that we were writing, I did some research. I called a number of coaches in the NFL that I knew had played with or had been coached by. And I asked about the makeup of their defensive backfield room. And every one of them told me that their entire defensive backfield was Black. And I thought, now, could there be an instance there where, Ruben, where coaches and evaluators, in some cases at the NFL level, where they get paid handsomely to be able to make these decisions, could there be some biases, some prejudices that cause that to cause that makeup to be what it is, where it's predominantly Black at that position? So, and Michael talked about it earlier about privileges that I had. So if you look at me and a fellow teammate of mine who's white, the chances are they're going to give me the benefit of the doubt if they are evaluating me for that defensive backfield position. Conversely, if that's corporate America, that leader is going to look at maybe the white guy and give them the benefit of the doubt. And these are some balances that we are working in society to ultimately get to. And sounds like your question is right on point as it relates to, well, how do we deal with that? And this is where I go back is aligning those, really clearly identifying what the values and the goals are, and then aligning your actions with those squarely focused on the merit of what it is that you're pursuing.
Thank you.
All right. With that, I think we have plenty to chew on with having recorded this. So we can go back and listen and try to formulate, right, Ruben, a way for athletes and engineers to work together here.
If I could, as we move towards a close real quickly, if I can just ask from as many who would like to respond, I'd like to know their overall greatest takeaway from the book. And whoever would like to go first, there may be a number of things, but if there was one that you had to identify as your overall greatest takeaway from it, love to be able to hear from a few people on that topic.
Yeah, let's put the students on the spot here. Let's get Anna, Thomas, Leanne, Yohav, Sokwithya, Kim Sang. You all went through 6 weeks. Go ahead, Sokwithya.
So for my biggest takeaway was when you point out like how people don't get involved, like how you pointed out like how white people, like white straight men don't like get involved in like diverse conversations because like they're afraid to mess things up. I didn't realize that because where I'm from, everyone just like comes in and just says their opinion. It doesn't matter where you're from, they just say it. And it's like, oh, I thought like that's also in some parts in America too. And then as I read your book, it's like, oh, it's not true. Some places, some people are afraid to say the wrong thing. And if they say the wrong thing, they'll be pointed out as like a racist or like a bigot.
Sure. Great point.
No. Anybody else? Anna?
I guess my biggest takeaway was I think it was like the first thing that we read, it was about like the imposter syndrome. And thinking about that it made me think of just how many people, including myself, like experience that, like for me on like a daily basis sometimes. And it was really interesting to see that it's not just my own self-esteem, it's like something that a lot of people experience.
Thank you.
Okay. But you Yohav?
Yeah, I agree with what Anna said. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I think that's it. I don't think the rest of them were a part of that group.
I have not read the book, but I will mention, just to keep this short, one of the takeaways from this conversation is, definitely understanding that there are a lot of sensitive issues that sometimes people are afraid of talking about. But I think creating spaces that we have allies that we can actually listen to provides us to be able to express and listen from the other side. I think the only way we can understand each other and it is to actually listen to what the other side has to say. And UMass Lowell actually has an awesome program called Ally Space, in which they train staff, faculty, and students to be able to become allies. And I think more important than ever, we need each other to become allies for those who are marginalized, to be able to speak up for them.
Ruben, if I can just say, not just marginalized, for all, because that's why that discomfort is so important. We all are going to feel some discomfort, but we have to have that ability to be able to speak and to be listened, heard, and understood, not based on my beliefs or the way I view it, but based on, which is the hardest thing to do, based on what you're trying to communicate to me. And that enables us to come together on a more purposeful platform to be able to seek resolution.
Okay. It is an optimistic book. Johnnie, you say, you're hopeful that we're closer to the destination in the book. I don't know, some of us are not very optimistic, but this book certainly kind of gives you some, that was my takeaway, that there are maybe things to do that can help you get there.
Sure, sure. It's a process. It's like running that relay. As long as we run our leg to the best of our ability and be ready to pass that baton, and if you just happen to be receiving that baton, get ready to run your leg.
The football analogy.
We all have to do our part. That's right.
Yeah. All right. So in closing, thank you very much. Thank you for taking the time. And we hope to continue to propagate this book in meaningful ways throughout our campus.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it. Thanks so much for your time and attention. And so glad you found us and found the book. It's really great to be part of this conversation with you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.